Another way that the fathers interpret this is the ladder as an image of the cross. And I think you can see there, but I'll flash the next slide so you can see it a little better. These are actually modern ladders here, right? Didn't think you could make a ladder that way, did you? Well, some of the fathers, when they read this text, are thinking of this ladder which is made up of crosses, right? And then a third interpretation of Jacob's ladder that comes through is the ladder itself as an image of the Theotokos. And by the way, this one I would say is the one that is most stuck into our hymnography. Pretty sure all three of these are present in our hymnography, like these three interpretations. Not that they're not meant to contradict one another or to oppose one another, but just different ways of understanding the same kind of mystical event, right? But in this image, Christ is envisioned as the God speaking from the top of the ladder, and also as the man Jacob, or perhaps the rock beneath Jacob's head. But he's the God who is speaking from the top of the ladder, and also potentially the man Jacob, with Mary being the bridge between the two, right? So Mary is where divinity and humanity come together. Okay, so those are some images. I just want to say as well, since we're on this passage, and I so wish I could do this for the entire book, but obviously I don't have time in this kind of setting. But some other fascinating patristic interpretations relate to this passage include Jacob bearing only a staff as an image of Christ bearing the cross. Again, the hero is carrying wood, right? Over and over again. Moses is going to have a staff when we see him, right? And then Jacob doing this very interesting thing. So after he gets up from the vision, he anoints the rock. And the fathers are all over this, because being anointed is being Christed, right? So chrism, Christos. It's, Christ means anointed one. So Jacob gets up, he anoints the rock, and so the fathers are just all over this, like, the cornerstone, the stone the builders rejected. God later in Genesis is going to be called the stone of Israel. In the Psalms, God is called the rock, and so on and so forth. So they're all over that as an image of Christ as well. Okay, and then finally, the last thing we're going to talk about regarding Jacob is Christ revealed in Jacob's blessings. So when Jacob is about to die, Joseph brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to his father for a blessing. And, again, following this pattern of primogeniture, Joseph expects that the old man Jacob is going to, with his right hand, so his preferred hand, bless the older son Manasseh, and with his left hand, he's going to bless the younger son Ephraim. Now, one of the things that's really fascinating about this passage is, it tells you in the Hebrew how he brought them up. This is how he lined them up and brought them forward. Well, Jacob is either blind or essentially blind at this point. But when the boys come forward, he goes like this and makes the form of the cross, actually. Once again, preferring the younger brother and putting the younger brother in the position of the older brother. And this is, again, by the fathers interpreted as a symbol of Christ, who is, in a way, Adam's junior, becoming his senior. Certainly, in a way, Moses' junior, like what follows. And then Christianity superseding Judaism. Okay, and then in the final blessing of the 12 sons, we have Jacob saying the following about Judah. So this is only the Judah snippet of the prophetic blessing narrative where Jacob goes through and blesses all of his sons. So he says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine, and his ass's colt to the choice vine, he washes his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white as milk. So for the fathers, this text is loaded with truly evocative imagery. And so, for instance, they see in it the eternal worship of Christ. Your brothers, your human brothers, right? Your human brothers shall praise you. Your father's sons shall fall down before you. They see Christ's conquest of the devil and of evil. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. They see Christ's death defeating death. And you know, there's a lot of patristic commentary on this idea of Christ the sleeping lion, right? And sleep being a metaphor for death. So he stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness who dares rouse him up. But they see that as an image of being asleep and not like ready to spring out of the... although those two things are together. I mean, you know, Christ is dead and asleep, but as a lion, he's ready to spring out of the grave, you know, conquering death. They see in this blessing Christ's descent from the tribe of Judah and also from David. So the scepter shall not depart from Judah until he comes to whom it belongs. Right? So Christ is going to come out of the tribe of Judah. Similarly, they see the kingship of Christ in the images of the scepter, the ruler's staff, and a phrase like, to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Some fathers also see the triumphal entry alluded to before the Passion, with this binding his foal to the vine and his ass's colt to the choice vine. Could take it or leave it, but some see that. And also, some see the Passion and its connection to the Eucharist. So he washes his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. All right. So finally we come to our last type, our last figure, Joseph. And again, much like the Jacob narrative, this is a very long and complicated narrative in Genesis, so we really can't do it the full justice. But the final protagonist in Genesis is Joseph, the firstborn son of Jacob by his wife Rachel. You'll recall Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines, right? From our last discussion. So Joseph's life, like that of Jacob, prefigures Christ. And as I said, for the sake of time, we're going to focus on very broad swath interpretations of his story. So Joseph begins life as the firstborn son of Jacob's favored wife, Rachel. Initially, Rachel is barren, which, like the previous instances of barrenness overcome, surely alludes to the virgin birth and possibly the resurrection. I would say regarding this, you know, poor Rachel, because, you know, if you were with us the last time, you know, she's in this biological arms race with her sister/rival, Leah. And I mean, by the time she has her first child, Leah and Leah's concubine and her concubine have had like 8 kids. And so she's quite barren, right? She's quite barren. Okay, so Joseph. Joseph is godly from his youth and is his father's favored son. You know, he even makes for him a Technicolor dream coat, if you can believe that. Or something like that. I think I read that somewhere.
Joseph, maybe amazing Technicolor.
Maybe I saw that on TV, didn't I?
It was musical, I believe.
Yeah. So Joseph is godly. And in fact, Joseph is the one patriarch whose life as portrayed in Genesis is basically sinless. Right? Everybody else we can point to, you know, Abraham, you know, caught you lying, Abraham. Caught you going on with you know, not waiting on God and sort of conspiring with Sarah to have this surrogate pregnancy through Hagar. etc. Jacob can't even pretend sinlessness. After the way that he does his brother, he can't pretend that. Joseph, on the other hand, his life is portrayed in Genesis. We get to the end of Genesis, and now we've arrived at a man who's really incredibly righteous, right? So these things prefigure Christ, who's completely righteous and is the favored son of the Father. So as a young man, Joseph manifests prophetic dreams, actually later on in his life as well, or he's able to interpret dreams. And this foreshadows Christ in his role as prophet. When he speaks of his God-given dreams to his brothers, they become enraged and conspire to kill him. So tell them the truth, and they decide to kill you. So like Christ, Joseph is hated and betrayed by his brothers. He is stripped of his robe. He's cast down into the earth, and he's sold into Egypt at Judah, aka Judas in the Greek, at Judah's request for 20 pieces of silver. Although I will note that some fathers attest to the existence of manuscripts that they know of, that although I don't think we have any, that actually have 30 pieces of silver. Isn't that cool, right? So he's betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Why do they even need to sell him? Well, they don't need to sell him for his own sake. They need to sell him because that's what's going to happen to Christ. Okay. So after various threats, like Potiphar's wife, and various sufferings in Egypt, Joseph miraculously rises to a position very much akin to prime minister. Okay, so, and in fact, actually, in some technical sense, it may be that he is the actually more powerful end of the him and Pharaoh cooperation, right? Like Pharaoh may very well be kind of living the life of a golden boy. I delegated it to my, first in command, and that's, kind of how things go. So this proves to be incredibly providential for his family, if not, the entire region. As Joseph's God-inspired direction of the Egyptian government saves the region from starvation during a massive 7-year-long famine. So when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt in search of food because they're starving, they and their children and their cattle, Joseph forgives them and saves their lives, ascribing all of the wickedness that they did to him ultimately to God's providence. And I think I included this in the last presentation as well, but just like you come to the end of Genesis and what perfection. What perfection. So we'll just read the passage here. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph should bear a grudge against us and pay us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" So they sent a message to Joseph saying, which may be a lie, by the way. You can't necessarily know, but it seems like it's probably a lie. "Your father charged us before he died, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgression of your the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him." Maybe he's crying because he realizes what his brothers are like. But Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then the brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your slaves." We are your servants, which really is better translated in most of the Old Testament as slaves. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So that's Joseph. So just to run it down then, Joseph's betrayal prefigures Jesus' betrayal. in his case, by even closer kinsmen than what Jesus is betrayed by. His being cast into the pit and entering Egypt, which is a land associated with, in Christian typology, with death, right? Sin, death, the devil, that's Egypt. That prefigures Christ's death. But he triumphs in Egypt, becoming its Lord and using it for God's purposes. Christ similarly conquers death and turns it into God's instrument of salvation. And like Christ, Joseph's righteousness and holiness manifest themselves in forgiveness. So here we've come to the end of the book, and what a profound final image we're given of the Christ who is to come. But much more could be said. But I don't want to get stoned by Maria. But I don't want to get stoned. But for the sake of brevity, we're just simply going to note that the pattern of protagonists' lives predicting the Christ carries on throughout the whole Pentateuch, right? So really, if you want to talk about protagonists in the rest of the Pentateuch, you've got Moses. You might have Aaron. You definitely have Joshua, right? And all three of these are predictive of the Christ. I mean, you have Moses, he's born, and people are trying to kill him. Like Christ, he's born, and Herod is trying to kill him. He's Israel's lawgiver. Well, Jesus becomes, very much in the Gospel of Matthew, he becomes the new Moses. He sits on the mount and issues commands. Moses is transfigured. His face shines like the sun. Well, guess what? That's a prefiguration of the transfiguration of Christ. And on and on and on and on. I mean, Moses' life is packed. And I've said before, I'll probably never get away with this, but, if I ever found the mission, there's a part of my heart that wants to name it Moses the God-Seer. But, I don't know how much traction that'll get with people. I'll probably turn it into like Jove Bachayev or something like that. Okay, Joshua, Greek Jesus. I mean, in Jesus in the Greek. His big thing is that unlike Moses, who, prefigures what the law is going to be unable to do, in that he is not able to lead the children of Israel into the promised land, right, which is a symbol of heaven or paradise. Joshua is the one who comes after Moses and leads the children of Israel in. So when the book of Deuteronomy closes, there's great expectation. Jesus is with us and he's taking us to the promised land. Okay. And there are also many other characters who maybe wouldn't be described as protagonists in Genesis, who portray Christ very dramatically. Notably among them Melchizedek, Judah, and Rebekah. All right. So now we're going to turn, again fairly briefly, to discussing the Trinity in Genesis. And Michael...
I'm not even going to attempt.
Okay, no. So that's Bereshit bara Elohim, and it's et hashemayim wa et haaretz. In the beginning, God created, is what this says. In the beginning, God created. And we'll see why I bring that up, just in terms of the Trinity in Genesis. So the second and third words of Genesis are already revealing the Trinity for us. The second word, bara, in and of itself is grammatically masculine and singular. So if you translate it by itself, it is he created. Right? He created. The third word, Elohim, is the most common generic Hebrew word for God, which acts as a singular noun in Hebrew. And yet, grammatically, it is a plural masculine word. So, you would expect it either to say, in the beginning, they created gods, or in the beginning, he created God. I mean, that is God is the creator, right? Doing the action. But instead, just looking at the words, it's in the beginning, he created gods. Right? Interesting. It's a plural singular. Woo. Okay. And so just to give you just a little bit more on that, some places where you can see it. So like cherubim, that's more than one cherub. So it's keruv, one cherub. You want to make it plural, masculine plural. It would be keruvot if it were female. But you want to make it masculine plural, cherubim. Likewise the seraph, the burning one, when you make him plural, he becomes seraphim, right? Now Hebrew does possess a truly singular word for God, El. But while Hebrew does possess that word, and it is used simply as God, the Hebrew Bible almost never uses it. I mean, it is used in the Hebrew Bible, but not very often. Not very often. Instead, the Hebrew Bible very consistently opts for Elohim, this plural-esque singular. Okay, so there's one place, and I could probably use that same slide for most any book of the Old Testament. But I think it's something important for you guys to be aware of. Very interesting, too, that God reveals himself in this Hebrew context, because everybody else, otheos, that's just a masculine singular in the Greek. Got in our Germanic background, it's just a masculine singular. Well, All right. So another place we see the Trinity in Genesis is these Genesis plurals. So at the creation of man, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Or, God says regarding the fall, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he stretch forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, let's kick him out. Okay, and then also at the Tower of Babel, come, let us go down. Some people have suggested that this is like some kind of court language, like, the Queen of England says, we proclaim thee a knight, dear sir, or something like that. I am not aware, I'm not saying that it's not possible, but I'm not aware of Hebrew having anything like that, like any kind of royal we. But this is something certainly that the fathers very much see as an image of the Trinity. There are many others, but again, I have got Maria breathing down my neck over there. She's sharpening her Abrahamic dagger. But the last major image I want to touch on is Abraham's three visitors. Now the Lord, and it's interesting because that's singular, appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, where he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, three men were standing opposite him. And that whole account is deeply evocative of the Trinity. But this is the icon on which our churches, our patronal icon and our feast is kind of based. And this, in the hands of our church iconographers, becomes often a very profound image. So the Greek title there is the love of the stranger of Abraham, or the hospitality of Abraham. But these three angels are used very profoundly as images of the Trinity in the church's art. Okay. And finally, the very last thing before we conclude is just to make a note on going back to the beginning of our presentation on the Trinity in creation. So you see I've got it color-coded here. So in the beginning, what do the fathers see primarily? God created the heavens and the earth, so primarily we're referring to the Father there. And the earth was formless of void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God, as distinct from God, was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And so this is a, again, in a certain way, the speaking is perhaps a little bit weak for us, as we're reading this. But that is a very, very patristic way. I mean, it's what John is doing, right, in John chapter 1. Okay. So we conclude with many, 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 many things unsaid. But I do want to say, as a conclusion, that Genesis is a prophetic and seemingly inexhaustible treasury of ideas, stories, and images that can help us see Christ and deepen our understanding of Him and of the whole mystery of the faith. So my encouragement would be, let us read it regularly and contemplate it to the best of our ability further as we can. Okay, there we go. So, thank you. So questions on Genesis? Are there any segments of this, if we're thinking about like adult ed for, say, next fall or next year or something like that, is there any episode from Genesis that anyone would like to see like a deep dive into?
Joseph?
Hmm?
The whole story of Joseph?
So the sort of the Joseph, that's an interesting, because, with an hour, you can get a lot farther in the Joseph story. Joseph is a very cool, just top to bottom, a very, very cool account. Okay. Any other questions here? You guys are quiet. Richard, you've got something, right?
No.
I know you said you weren't going to ask
I
him.
promised. No.
Well, I have authority
they
to...
can't kill you, but they can kill me.
Oh! Wow.
I'll save my questions.
Okay.
It would be interesting to dive a little bit more into Judah, especially as like a
Good choice, yes.
especially as contrasted with like I think it was Reuben.
Right. Yeah. So Judah is interesting because he is very much an image of, I think, repentance. Mm-hmm. Because he, over the course of the narrative, so he moves from being this kind of unstable, obviously he's part of the group. I can't remember, Reuben ends up being the one who's like, let's not kill Joseph, let's just sell him into, or let's not kill Joseph, and then I think Judah's the one who brings up the idea of selling him into slavery. I could be mistaken on this. Yeah. And then you've got the episodes of Judah, where he's got his sons who are practicing Levirate marriage with this woman. The first son marries her and then he dies. And the second son marries her and then he dies. And there ain't no way Judah's going to let the third son marry her, even though apparently in the custom of that day and also in the law of Moses, it's kind of his duty, that he needs to have this third son marry the daughter. And so, she ends up dressing up like a prostitute and seduces him, and he doesn't know, what's going on. And she has a child, and he's really mad at her because she's sleeping around, even though he won't, whatever. But it turns out that she's pretty clever, and she takes an insignia from him and proves to him that in fact the child is his. Anyway, so Judah is this kind of figure of really questionable character, but by the end of the narrative, what is it? I want to say he is willing to sell himself into slavery to save his brothers. Mm-hmm. Let me see here. Yeah, let's see. Yeah. Oh well, can't find it quickly.
Because there were two. Because I thought initially Reuben saying, you can kill my sons if I don't bring Benjamin back to you to his father. But Judah's like, puts his own life up and then offers to become the slave of the one bound in Egypt instead of Benjamin, so that Benjamin can go back to his father.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's right. Goodbye. Okay. Anybody else have any So yeah, Judah and Joseph. I mean, we could potentially kind of deep dive because their narratives are intertwined with one another. I mean, you're dealing with like the tail end of the book, although it's a long tail end, relatively speaking. I mean, when compared to beginning narratives. Okay, well, I'll give that some thought. All right. Any other books of the Old Testament? Please don't say Psalms. So I feel it is my duty at some point in my life to make a real deep dive study of Psalms, but I'm terrified of it. Because there's so many angles in order to do it well that you have to be able to come at that book from. And it's not like a narrative book is pretty simple. It's like, you've got sort of, okay, plot arc, we don't have any of that with the Psalms. So, okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, let's sing.
Christ is risen from the dead, trampled by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life.
Christos Anesti.
Christos Anesti.